In the first two movies of this chapter, we created the necessary HTML structure for the header portion of this layout, and we also reviewed the established class and ID selectors associated with the F2FW framework that will help us position this content a little bit later on. In this movie, what we want to do is create this gradient background. Now again, it may be difficult to see, but it is in fact a gradient. And if you zoom into this section, you can see that it starts off at a very dark gray, almost a black, up to a slightly lighter gray, but still very dark. We want to produce this using CSS for the sheer fact that it's going to create a lighter weight, better performing page. Now, if cross-browser compatibility was your top concern, you would consider creating an image and tiling that image across the background of this div element. But like I said, for our purposes, we want to generate CSS. Now, if you've worked with CSS in the past, and I'm assuming you have, you may have worked with the experimental properties when it comes to creating gradients within CSS3. If that's the case, you know that it's no easy task to produce that code. Not only do you have to write slightly complicated code to generate the gradient, but then you have to factor in all the browser-specific prefixes when it comes to producing this gradient. Instead of having to write that out by hand, I'm going to show you a resource that you may consider using if you need to produce gradients using CSS3. So here you can see I have Opera open, and I'm already on the ColorZilla website. The ColorZilla website gives you the ability to create CSS gradients with a Photoshop-like interface. So we're going to come over here on the right-hand side and click on the Ultimate Gradient Generator. And when you do, you'll notice there are several presets in a panel that looks a lot like Photoshop. If you go ahead and select this second one, of course, it's going to give you a darker gradient, which is a better starting point than blue. But you'll notice it's very three-dimensional, and you can see all these different color stops. Again, if you're comfortable with Photoshop, you know that you can move these color stops off by clicking and dragging. If you start to remove these color stops, you'll notice that the code over here on the right-hand side also gets decreased because we're writing fewer property values for the background to generate the gradient. We want a pretty simple gradient. So here we have one color going to another color, and the orientation is vertical, which is what we want. We just want this color to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to click on the color stop. It loads the color into this color well. If you click on it, you'll notice you're not at true black. You can tell by the values here and the hex code. You can either plug in those values or you can drag this dropper down here to the bottom left-hand corner until you get zeros across the board in hue, saturation, and brightness values, or red, green, and blue, or hexadecimal. Whatever the case may be, it should be all zeros. That's giving you a true black color. Go ahead and click OK. Once you click OK, you can then come over and click on the gray color stop. And again, click on the inkwell and choose a darker gray. Go ahead and click OK. Once you do, you can see that this gradient here is pretty similar to what we have here inside of Photoshop. I'm just doing it visually. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. This is pretty close. If we now come over and take a look at the CSS that's generated, we can see that we have a background property setting the RGB value. This is good for any web browser that doesn't understand the linear gradient properties. Here we have browser prefixes for those linear gradient properties. And then down here towards the bottom, we don't have the browser prefix. So once the linear gradient property becomes a complete property in terms of the CSS3 specification, you won't have to worry about removing these browser prefixes for it to work properly. You'll also notice that there's a filter down here towards the bottom, which is designed to help Internet Explorer generate this gradient. From my experience, it's pretty buggy, so we're going to remove it. What we want to do here is copy all of this code. And notice you can change the color format. Right now it's set to RGB, but you could set it to any one of these values. I'm happy with RGB. And if you want comments, you can add those. It's just going to essentially comment which browser prefix belongs to which browser. I'll go ahead and deselect comments. And I'm going to come over here now and copy this to the clipboard. Once you copy it to the clipboard, you can come back to your HTML editor. And what we want to do inside of our HTML editor is create a new ID selector. If you remember, when we created the HTML structure, we had a div element surround several other div elements that ultimately will contain the logo and menu system, and it has an ID of header. This is the div element that we want to add the background property to. So if we come back to style.css, we can go ahead and create that ID selector. Go ahead and type in header, and then you can paste the code. Once you paste the code, you may want to select the body of text and just tab it over. You do want to remove this filter. I mean, you don't have to. I'm going to remove it because, like I said, it's a little unpredictable, but it was designed to help Internet Explorer generate these gradients. So again, this looks pretty good. I'm happy with the code. Go ahead and save the style sheet file, Control S or Command S on the Mac. Return back to index.html. If you want to see the gradient, we're going to need some content here. So if we just type the word text inside the header div and save the index page, we can go ahead and preview this in our WebKit-based browser. I'm going to go ahead and use Chrome, and you should see the gradient. Now again, the gradient's not as tall as it needs to be, but we don't have any content yet within that div element, which will ultimately dictate its height. But we did successfully generate the gradient, which is obviously what we wanted to do in this movie. In the next movie, what we'll do is we'll look at how we can get the logo to appear on the left-hand side.